Well, the haters gonna hate, 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 and the fakers gonna fake, 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 baby. I'm just gonna making luck, a Dominion podcast.
Welcome to Making Luck, a Dominion podcast. My name is Adam, and this is Jake. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm pretty good, Adam. I am ready to record a podcast.
Well, unfortunately, that's not what's about to happen right now. So today is Monday, July 30th, 2018, and we just got done recording an episode, but the important thing is that you're not going to listen to that episode next, because you already listened to that episode on the day after July 30th, 2018.
Right?
Right, and if you didn't...
you should do that.
I mean, it's probably a good episode, sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, the thing is, Jake and I, we have lives that don't revolve around Dominion.
That's right. Adam has a life that doesn't revolve around Dominion.
Okay.
I show up sometimes.
I'm gonna have a child soon, and I've been told that that's gonna take up a lot of my time, and it's completely reasonable to think that either one of us is gonna be busy, and maybe it's gonna be hard for us to record a podcast episode, but it's not okay with me to go a week without some content for you guys.
That's true.
So what we're doing is we're going to pre-record a whole bunch of episodes, and we're going to call them Minisodes. And these are just going to be various things. Sometimes it's going to be us making them. Sometimes it's going to be Wandering Winder making them. Sometimes it's just going to be whatever we have that maybe doesn't make up an entire episode, but it's something that we can put out as content that you can listen to while we have other things in our life going on.
Yeah. No, it sounds pretty good. Borderlands 3 is coming out, and I don't think anybody... it's at least announced, and I don't think anybody's going to hear from me for, at least a couple of years.
Yeah.
Once it drops. So.
Yeah, so we're going to have some mini-sodes ready to go.
Yeah.
So the main reason that this is different from any other episode is that the kingdoms we talk about at the beginning of the episode and the end of the episode, we're just going to skip this one. So the one you listen to, the last kingdom you listen to, we'll get to that on the next normal episode.
Yeah, for now we are going to talk about not that kingdom, because we don't know what that kingdom is yet. It's in the future.
Yeah.
This is kind of a time warp for us.
Yeah, it's like a couple shuffles ahead.
Well, yeah. That was pretty good. Yeah, so we come to you from the past. Greetings. Ronald Reagan is not president again. I don't know if that joke made any sense.
Isn't he dead?
Is he dead?
I'm pretty sure Ronald Reagan's dead. Is he dead?
Is Ronald Reagan dead? Let us know in the comments if Ronald Reagan is dead.
Yeah, maybe he isn't now, but he is by the time you listen to this.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for listening to this podcast. We hope you enjoy whatever topic comes after this, and we hope you understand that interaction's going to be a little bit low this week, but at least you've got some content, and my child probably just crapped all over me, and I just want you to share in that experience.
That's true. I can already feel it.
I can already smell it.
It's radiating.
Enjoy the minisode.
Making Luck Minisode. Wandering Winder here with a Making Luck Minisode. Today I want to talk about money decks, and in particular, today's episode we're going to talk about what do I mean, a definition. What do I mean when I say money decks? Why is that a useful thing to talk about? And what can we learn just based on kind of the bare bones definition and understanding of what makes a money deck a money deck? So let's jump right into it here. When I'm talking about a money deck, what I mean is a deck that lives on a money density paradigm. So the payload of any given turn in a money deck is based on money density. What's money density, you ask? Great question. Money density per card is just the total amount of money that all of the cards in your deck can produce divided by the effective number of cards in your deck. So let's take your starting deck, for example. You have 7 coppers, you have 3 estates. 7 coppers each make 1 money, so that's a total of 7. These states don't make any money. So your total money in your deck is 7. Number of cards in your deck is 10. 7 divided by 10, 0.7. That's your money density per card. In your starting deck, it's not very good, but your starting deck isn't very good, and that shouldn't be news to anybody. So that's your money density per card, and then when you're in the money density paradigm, basically to find out what the payload of a turn is, on average, you take your average money density per card, 0.7, multiply it by the number of cards in your hand, which is 5, because you're only dealing with a 5-card hand in this money paradigm, in a money deck. So you get about 3.5 money per turn, right? And of course you have some amount of variation thereupon. In the start of the game, the variation isn't really that high. You almost always have 3 or 4, sometimes you have 2 or 5, and that's all you have. As the game goes on, you buy a silver and a silver on your first shuffle, say. So then your next shuffle, again, time in Dominion is measured in shuffles. Your next shuffle, you have 11 money in 12 cards, which gives you a money density of 0.91666666 blah blah blah, so about 0.92. That's your money density per card. Your average hand, you're looking at about 4.6 coins per turn. And again, that should jive with your experience. If you've played a decent number of games and opened silver enough, you know that you usually get a 4 and a 5. Sometimes you get a 3 and a 5, or a 3 and a 6, or a 4 and a 6, or a 5 and a 5. Occasionally get like a 2 and a 5, and you're very unhappy because you just got your starting again, whatever. But 4 and a 5 is kind of the typical range you're in, with some amount of variation. As the game goes on, the variation can go up or down. But the point is, this is the paradigm that you're under. You have your average money density, multiply that by your 5 cards, and that's kind of what your turn looks like, with some amount of variation around there. In this kind of money deck, what you're doing is you're just buying cards, right? You have your 5-card hand, you play your cards, you buy a card. It's very simple in the action phase. You can have action cards for sure. You play all the action cards you can. Usually there's not very much trickiness to order to play them in, just because there's not a lot of choices. Occasionally you have more than one. You have to pick, well, this terminal is better than that one, but really usually not that difficult of choices to make in the action phase. And most of your choices then come in the buy phase. What should I buy right now? We'll get more in depth into that later on, a little bit in this episode, and then in later minisodes. So this is the paradigm that I'm talking about when I talk about money decks. So what it doesn't mean is, I'm drawing all my deck, drawing almost all my deck. It doesn't mean that I somehow have a prearranged set of 5 cards in my hand. So, because the other thing about this paradigm is that you're really looking at 5 average cards from your hand in order for this to apply, right? My average card is making me 0.7 money, or 0.92 money, or 1 money, or something. For that to be relevant, then you need to actually be drawing, just a random sampling of your cards every turn. Or, random, except that obviously you can't draw what you drew the previous turn. So you're not doing things like setting up the top of your deck every turn with scheme or in some other fancy way. You're also getting most of the effect of your payload is the actual money, right? So if the goal of my deck is to play a bunch of ironworks and gain a bunch of cards that way, then that's going to behave differently from what I'm talking about here. A little bit of gain, can happen in this deck. A little bit of card draw can happen in this kind of deck. But once you start to get a lot of any of these other kinds of things, you start to move away from this paradigm. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with the money density paradigm. That's kind of the definition that we're going under. What can we learn from this, just from this, regardless of all the other stuff? Well, okay. the first thing to note is that you're only seeing a pretty small fraction of your deck on any given turn, right? So in my starting deck, I'm only seeing half of it every turn. That's not that small of a fraction, but pretty soon after a couple shuffles, you're seeing a third of your deck or a quarter of your deck, and it goes down and down as the game goes on, right? So that means that every individual card that you're changing your deck by matters a little bit less, right? If I'm seeing, and particularly because you're not drawing a lot of cards, this actually amplifies the effect, right? So if I have a 15 card deck and I add a silver to it, then I'm only seeing that silver about once every 3 turns. So you would expect that the effect that the silver has on my deck might be about a third of the effect of the silver, right? So you might think that's about zero point 0.6 or zero point 0.7 money, but it's actually less than that, right? Because not only am I only seeing the silver every 3 or 4 turns, but also I'm actually seeing the silver instead of another card, right? Because I'm only drawing my 5 cards, then I'm buying I'm buying a silver, and that means that when I draw the silver, I have it instead of another card. If I wouldn't have had the silver, I would have had a different card. And so if the average card in my deck is producing about 1 money, and then I add a silver, I'm not getting a third of the silver. I'm getting a third of the difference between the silver and my average replacement card, right? There's an analogous thing that in baseball they used to have value over replacement player. Now they usually call it wins above replacement, but it's a similar idea here, right? You're comparing it to the baseline replacement. And so as the game goes on, each card has less and less of an impact because, first of all, the difference between that card and your average card usually goes down as the card quality of your deck gets closer to a card that you might be adding. Also, and probably still the more important effect is that you're just seeing each individual card less and less often. You also see it later, right? If I have a deck of 20 cards, then I'm only going to see this card that I add every 4 turns on average, which means that on average, before I see it again, it'll be 4 turns. Now you might think it's only 2 turns because half the time I see it at the start and half the time I see it at the end, but it depends on where in the shuffle you buy it, and that's a road we don't need to go down in too much depth. You can work that out yourself, but it's you're going to see it every 4 turns. And additionally, the knock-on effect from this is, particularly the later you go into the game, when you add a card, the fewer overall times you're going to see it, because the game is only going to go on, so many more turns. Turn 10, the game might go on another 5 turns. I only see the card once every 5 turns. I'm probably going to see it like 1 time in this kind of a deck. So that's another thing to keep aware of. So because you're only seeing this smaller fraction of cards every turn, and all of these effects that I just mentioned, each card's effect is less, which means that, it means a few different things, right? One, it means that it's harder to combo cards together, right? If I need to play a village and a smithy in the same turn, I need to see them together in order to make it work. Well, it's just going to be pretty unlikely in a deck that's 20 cards deep and I'm only seeing about 5 cards per turn. Now, obviously, village and smithy together, maybe not the greatest example here because the more of them you have, you start to move into being able to have, you're seeing not just the 5 cards per turn, but the more of that kind of thing you're getting, the more you're moving away from this money paradigm that I'm talking about. You're moving more towards a drawing your deck kind of paradigm, right? But let's say a festival and your terminal action that you want to play. So let's say there's a festival and I want to play it with Monument, right? In a 20 card deck, it's kind of unlikely that I'm going to see my festival and my monument on the same turn. And to get the plus action effect out of the festival, you not only need that, but you actually need two monuments, right? So you need, out of your 20 card deck, you need your 5 cards to include multiple terminals and your village effect in the same turn. And this is just very unlikely. So it's hard to combo cards together. So if you're trying to get cards that need to be in the same hand together in this kind of a deck, that's usually not going to work out very well for you. So that's one thing to note. And there's a lot of cards on a lot of types of cards that function this way. So if I have a money deck, then I'm trying to combo urchin and urchin together, or cultist and cultist together, or whatever it is. That's hard. But similarly, if I'm trying to combo together a trasher with the junk that I need to trash, that's going to be pretty tough too. And so unless there's some specific way you have of making sure that those things line up with each other, so upgrade is still going to counter Sea Hag, junk dealer is still going to counter Sea Hag, because that curse is going to be on the top of your deck if it's getting played against you every turn. Or if there's some kind of a search property where you can search out a way to make sure that these things come together. Golem is still going to hit your actions every time because it searches for actions, so that's fine. But in general, if you don't have some kind of a mechanism like this to ensure that your combo comes together, it won't come together very often. And so generally in these kinds of decks, you're not looking for combinations of cards, you're just looking for cards that are more or less independently good on their own. Another thing that falls out as a consequence of only drawing a fairly small fraction of your deck every turn is that, thinning is not great for you. And so we already talked about how comboing your thinning card with your junk that you want to thin out is harder. So that's one aspect of it. But additionally, if you just look at, since the main metric by which we're measuring our deck quality in this kind of paradigm is the money density, if you talk about removing a bad card from your deck, that does improve your money density. So it's not that thinning is bad, right? Thinning isn't bad, it's still generally good if you can thin out bad cards from your deck. But it's not that good, right? So if I just even look at my starting deck, 3 estates, 7 coppers, I want to thin an estate out. Well, thinning an estate out is going to get me to 7 money and 9 cards, which is going to get me to a money density of 0.7777. Whereas when we talked about buying a silver, that gets you to a money density of 9 money in 11 cards, and that's a money density of 0.82. It's actually better for your deck to add a silver than it is for it to remove an estate in this paradigm. And that can change as your actual money density changes somewhat, right? So if I have 15 money and 15 cards, then adding a silver is going to do, let's just do the calculation here. It's going to get you to 17 money and 16 cards. It's going to give you a money density of 1.0625. Whereas if you remove an estate, you're still going to have 15 money and 14 cards, and that's going to give you a money density of 1.071. So in that case, it is a little bit better to remove the estate than it is to add the silver. So it depends a little bit, but you can see that silver is basically always a good card for these decks, but it's not usually a super fantastic, oh my gosh, great card. And so you can see that adding a silver and removing an estate, roughly speaking, have reasonably similar impacts. So it's not that you necessarily want to avoid thinning estates, and coppers are obviously even less of an impact, right? We're talking about usually most of the time your money density is around the neighborhood of 1. Usually for most of the game it's somewhat higher than 1, so thinning those coppers is a positive thing, but the impact on your money density is very small because your money density, again, your average was close to 1 anyway, so taking a card out that had a money density of 1, while it does help, it doesn't help by a ton. So thinning, not great. It's good. You still want to do it if it's reasonably easy to do, but you don't want to go so far out of your way in this kind of a deck to thin. In particular, estate thinning is much better than copper thinning. Obviously, junk thinning is similar to estate thinning in this respect. What else happens? So, similarly, you can talk about the effect of a tax. So, your deck is resilient to greening. I guess we should talk about this a little bit before the attacks, but it's going to be similar when you're talking about junking, right? If you have a thick deck, you're only seeing a small fraction of cards per turn. Again, we talked about that a few times, and we're just going to keep coming back to that. It's kind of going to be the theme of this episode. But one consequence of that, each card you add does less. That's a bad thing when you're adding good cards, but it's a good thing when you're adding bad cards. So if I'm going to add a green card to my deck and I'm only seeing a fifth of my deck every turn, it's going to shift my average cost downwards, or my average money density downwards, but not by that much, right? It's relatively small impact just adding a one green card to my thick deck is. So that tells you that, in a slog, this can be quite an effective thing. Adding, over time, you're going to add a lot of green cards, but you're not going to shuffle your deck that much. You're changing the flow of time that way because you're shuffling your deck less often. Your deck is thicker. You're seeing fewer of those cards every turn. It has less of an impact on a money paradigm deck than it would have on other decks where you're seeing more of your deck every turn. So greening doesn't hurt you so much. It still hurts you, of course, but it doesn't hurt you so much. And it's a similar thing when it comes to junking attacks. Junking attacks are still bad for you, don't get me wrong, but it's not as bad as it would be in other kinds of decks. Now, again, we mentioned earlier that thinning is hard to line up with your junk. So it's also, you're going to be stuck with the junk for forever, more than likely. Sometimes you can thin a little bit of it out, but more than likely you're going to be stuck with this junk forever. So that is a bad thing, and other kinds of decks may be able to eventually deal with the junk better. But if you have just having the junk in your deck, if we're not talking about removing it, having the junk in your deck isn't as bad for this kind of a deck as it is for other decks, just because you're seeing few of your cards every turn anyway, so it doesn't hurt you so much to have one extra one that's bad. Again, still bad, but not as bad. And this is also why in this kind of a paradigm you can think about the effect of cursing versus, say, something like a ruins. The cursing, the difference between the two is a lot more heightened in this kind of a deck than it would be in other decks that are drawing more, that are seeing more of their deck every turn. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, the points actually matter more, as we'll see when we talk about how these decks win the game. But also the positive effects of the ruins are more pronounced in this kind of a money deck than they would be in other decks, because hey, that library, that ruined library draws me a card that's not good, but it is some reasonable facsimile of what my average card is anyway. The ruined mine that gives me a money, that's definitely worse than my average card, especially because it takes an action for me to do it, but it's some reasonable facsimile. Like, it's not that much worse than my average card, right? So the different kinds of junk also make a difference. Other attacks have different effects here too, though. So discard attacks are particularly brutal because instead of having this 5-card hand to try to make your money with, you only have a 3-card hand. And it's very hard for a money-based deck to be able to cope with that. Now, it is worth mentioning that the best 3 cards is a lot different from an average 3 cards. So it's not just average money density times 3. But, and so the math is a little complicated there. I'm not going to try to cover that just in this mini-sode. But the point still is, even if you're looking at your best 3 cards, you have a thick deck, it's very unlikely that those 3 cards can make a province, because you need gold, gold, silver, or gold, 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 and or equivalents thereof. And so it's kind of hard. Sometimes there's some actions that can give you like a burst, or even treasures that can give you a burst of money. all at once. But in general, it's much harder, particularly if you have to line up all of your good cards at once. It's hard to do that, and so it's very hard under constant discard attacks to be able to get to your province. And the flip side of this is, because again you're only seeing a small fraction of cards every turn, it's very hard for this kind of a deck to continually or with good reliability be playing any particular attack on every turn, just because it's very hard to have that many of the attacks, such that, if I have a deck of 20 cards or 25 cards, if I have 5, I'm going to see 1 on average per turn, but there's some amount of variation. They're going to collide somewhat. So in order to be, have a good chance to do it every turn, you're going to need almost the whole stack, which is just not reasonable, and you're going to have a lot of collision in that case. So basically, because you're seeing this small fraction of your deck, you're not going to be able to play these attacks consistently. Other kinds of attacks also behave a little bit differently against this deck than otherwise. The top of your deck attacks, I think, affect it a little bit less, but it very much depends on the particular attack in question and kind of what your deck is doing a little bit, and what elements you have in it. So that's a little bit hard to say, although I think, again, because the average card in your deck and whatever the worst card in your deck is are generally not completely qualitatively different in a money deck. Usually that top of your deck attack it definitely still hurts you, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt you as much as it might otherwise. So that's something to keep in mind. And then trashing attacks, you're more resilient to trashing attacks, again, just because you have a thicker a deck, so that first of all, if you have some key card, it's going to be less likely that key card gets hit, because you just have more overall cards, more likely to hit something else. But additionally, you're just less likely to have a key card in general. Like, your cards are more interchangeable and replaceable with each other. So it's going to mess up the balance of your deck a lot less, because your cards are more interchangeable with each other than you might see in other decks. They mostly perform the same kinds of functions of just generating money for you, because that's just kind of what this deck does. It generates money, it buys the best card, and then it moves on. So that's how attacks just come out of this definition. We also want to talk about how the deck ramps up, right? And so a money-based deck generally ramps up more quickly than other decks at the very beginning. And that's because, well, every deck is bad at the very beginning, but because all you're doing is looking to add payload to your deck from the very beginning, you can start doing that right away. You can add a silver, you're changing your deck, just on that first shuffle, you're buying the 2 silvers, you're increasing the amount of money you have per hand by almost, after that first shuffle, almost a full coin per turn, right? So that's actually a pretty fast ramp up to start. And because you can dive immediately for the good payload cards, you ramp up pretty quickly at the start. Then later on, however, like we talked about, the speed at which you're ramping up slows down a lot, because your deck gets thicker, your deck is better to start with, so the difference between the card that you're adding and the average quality of your deck is lower, and you see it less often. So it starts to stagnate, and you're not increasing the quality of your deck near as fast anymore. So there's this diminishing returns aspect in a money deck, versus if you were in a deck which was building to draw its whole deck every turn. It would start off slow because you're not really adding payload at the start so much as you're trying to get your deck control. But once you have complete deck control established in that kind of a deck, if I buy a silver, then I'm adding 2 to every turn instead of adding the fractional difference between this card and my average card times the fractional amount of time that I see the card. You're seeing it every turn, you're drawing it, it's the full 2 or almost the full 2. So you ramp faster to start with, but the differences diminish and it slows down over time. So based on the things that we've seen there. And based on some of the stuff we talked about earlier, then we can actually even start to think about how this kind of deck wants to win the game. And this is kind of the last thing I want to talk about in this episode. So money decks, there's kind of two ways that they want to win the game. But in general, it always falls under you want to outscore your opponent. So either that means that you're just going to, because you're ramping up faster, you're going to score points faster. You're going to get, more of the provinces than they can deal with you having before they are up and running and to the point where they can start greening. So I'm going to get, to 5 provinces, and then they just can't come back, something like that. So speed, that's one way that you can win with this kind of deck. The other way that you can win is longevity. And so how is longevity going to work? Well, in order for longevity to work for you, you need to be able to make sure that the game is going to last long enough such that your opposing deck is going to have to take green cards that, because again, this is assuming you're not playing a mirror. If you're playing a mirror, things change. But if you're playing against a deck which is drawing more cards, the green card doesn't have as big of an effect on your deck as it has on a deck that draws more cards. So if you can make sure that the game is going to go in a way where you have to add a lot of green cards to your deck, in something like a slog where you're getting duchies and dukes, or you're getting lots of green cards in Silk Roads, and you need a lot of green cards in order to be able to score your points, then you can win a long game that way. So those are kind of two different ends of the spectrum. You're either playing for a speed game or you're playing for a long game. You don't want to mix the two generally, although occasionally it can happen. But these are the ways you generally are trying to win the game. And so, the simplified way of understanding that is that you're winning the game by outscoring your opponent. And I know that sounds a little bit like, well, duh, you always win by scoring more points than your opponent. But very often other kinds of decks, and occasionally your money decks, but not very often, the way that they win is by having a better deck quality, by the end of the game or by some mid to late point in the game. I'm just going to build a better deck than you. My deck is going to be stronger. It's going to have better outputs. And I'm going to use that to convert into a win, either in a particular way, given the kingdom that you have, the board that you have in front of you, or in a fairly generic way. Once I have a good deck, I can pick at leisure kind of one of many different ways to win, depending on what opening you give me, right? And so that's, a lot of decks will win that way, but money decks usually don't. Money decks usually win by saying, I'm going to score more points than you. And again, money decks, usually they're not winning by saying, I'm going to make sure that I end the game while it's ahead. They look at it more in terms of, I'm going to score more points than you, and then the game will, end at some point. So it's less about controlling when the game ends, although that's still something to keep in mind because you do have interplay with your opponent. I did say that was the last thing, but I guess I'm just going to mention very briefly, because I did tease a little bit earlier. When you're looking to play this deck, the action phase is simple. The buy phase is where all of your important decisions are made. And how you make those decisions, the general framework, and again, we're going to expound on this in later episodes, but the general framework is, what is the best card for my deck, quote unquote, right now, while also keeping in mind that knowing what your win condition is, you generally are going to prioritize buying a piece of that pretty highly. So if you can get a province, you usually get the province. But if you're trying to build your deck more, you get the card that's best for your deck right now, with the caveat that, once again, time in Dominion is measured in shuffles. And so you do need to plan a little bit ahead on what is going to be the best card for my deck, not necessarily exactly right now, but for the next shuffle, keeping in mind however many other things you can expect to buy and what those things might be before that shuffle happens. So mainly that comes into effect when you're trying to determine which terminals to get versus treasures. Because treasures are always safe things to add, but terminals give you a little more oomph, a little more power. Yeah, I think that covers it for today. We'll be back soon with another Making Luck Minisode.